Hi, thanks so much for those of you who joined the online training on how to become the best critical thinker in your workplace. So sorry, I think there's some technical problems and weren't able to hear some of the Q&A. So I just wanted to re-record that for you all. There's some great questions and we didn't have a ton of time to cover it, but wanted to, just answer some of those questions that were asked. So I'm going to go through that list now. All right. So the first question was, what is the role of mentoring and coaches in the development of critical thinking skills? I would say it is huge. That's where we kind of started on this journey to helping people build critical thinking skills. We said, first it was me as a manager saying, how do I get my teams to think at another level? They're doing great work in terms of like what I asked them to do, but they're not pushing the envelope in terms of how they're thinking about things. And so that's kind of where it all started is. And so super valuable. There's Stanford psychologist BJ Fogg talks about 3 ways in which we can change our behavior, which is another version of developing a skill. The first is having an epiphany, so getting new information, and that's hard to control. But the second is changing your environment. And when you think about a employee or professional, one of the best ways and most powerful ways to change their environment is to change the nature of, or the tendencies or the behaviors of their manager and mentor or coach. That's a great way to change anyone's behavior, essentially, is to change those who are influencing them. The other way, the third way that BJ Fogg talks about is changing our own behaviors. And so certainly something that we have control and agency over, but also something that we can be greatly influenced by those around us. So certainly if you're a manager or a team leader, definitely would encourage you to invest in building these skills in your team. Okay. The next question was, to what extent is there research describing the impact of critical thinking skills on business outcomes, so revenue, KPIs, OKRs, etc. And so what I would point to is a few things that we talked about in the training. One is that cited the data that 84% of senior managers in one survey said that they experienced organizational loss due to the lack of critical thinking or absence of critical thinking. And so there, that's self-reported, but what it's suggesting is that those who are in leadership are experiencing detrimental effects because of the absence of critical thinking. The other kind of side angle that I would take to kind of approach this is another data point we shared, which is that 60% of managers say that critical thinking is the number one skill lacking in recent graduates or recent hires. And so there again, this isn't a direct causal tie in terms of critical thinking skills to business outcomes. But we're seeing is that the people who are in leadership, the people who are working on the front lines, are saying that when critical thinking is lacking, it affects how we do business, and they're recognizing and attributing it to critical thinking. Now, more scientific, causal research around, basically what they had people do is take an IQ test, take a critical thinking assessment, and then they had them do a self-reported survey on what type of things they had experienced in their life. And what they found was that critical thinking more than IQ actually was predictive of the quality of someone's life. And so high critical thinking skills meant that people had fewer negative life events, which is another way of saying, for the most part, obviously there's more to it, but that they made fewer negative decisions over the course of their life, up until the point in which they were surveyed. And so what that shows us is that, the research shows and proves that people with higher critical thinking skills on average make better decisions and lead to better outcomes in life. And so again, it's not a perfect direct source of research on that question, but kind of paints the picture from multiple angles of the power of critical thinking on business outcomes. Okay. Another great question was, just looking at my list here of the questions, was, when you're teaching this in a corporate setting, are there certain characteristics or traits of those who are more inclined to learn critical thinking or will have more success with developing critical thinking skills. And here's what I would say is, there's a group of academics, I think it was the late 80s, maybe 90s, that came together and said, let's come up with a coherent definition of critical thinking and kind of framework and understanding of that for the educational system. And one of the big debates that this group had was that, they distinguished, they said, okay, we have these critical thinking skills, like skills, in terms of things we talked about, problem solving, interpretation. And then what they also identified was what they called critical thinking dispositions, which is a way of saying kind of like personality traits or tendencies of people. And there's a big debate over whether the definition of critical thinking actually should include both of these or only the skills. And, they were kind of split on that. But what that shows is that dispositions are super important. Now, whether or not we include it in the definition, it doesn't really matter. But what's important is that we know that certain dispositions are associated with excellence in critical thinking and the ability to develop those skills. And so, you won't be surprised, but, some of those are open-mindedness. So again, when it comes to the recommend phase, the ability to consider multiple perspectives and not be egocentric. Another one has to do with honesty and candor, both with yourself and with others. And so can you honestly, do you honestly look at your own thoughts and assess those objectively, or are you applying filters to how you're thinking through things? Another one that was interesting is the ability to bring order into complexity. And so that, as we talked about, has a lot to do with the synthesize phase, which is how do you identify patterns and categorize information in a meaningful way. And so so yes, there are certain dispositions that are associated with the ability to develop critical thinking skills at a much higher rate. What we tried to do when we were identifying those plateaus or barriers where people get stuck is actually come at some of those mindsets that people can have, or tendencies or personality traits that people can have that can keep them from moving forward, and help illuminate those and then help them overcome them. And so that's a bit of what we're trying to do there in terms of helping people get beyond those and get stuck or get unstuck. Okay. Another question that was asked was, are critical thinking skills relevant for blue collar workers? And there I would say certainly yes, unequivocally yes. One of the examples I gave in the training was around the Japanese automakers, and that when more decision making was handed down to them so that they had choices and the ability to influence and control the outcomes of their work, that the performance of the company, Toyota, overall far exceeded that of their competitors. And so there we see that, someone who's on an assembly line, that they're being given permission and an environment that was conducive to critical thinking actually improved business outcomes. Was certainly required of them, though they might not have thought of it consciously, to do exceptional work. Maybe not to do average work, but to do exceptional work. And if you think, even about phase one, which is execute, basically every worker in any situation, any student has to be able to execute. Can they take instructions and translate that into action? And so they might not have to operate at the generate level too often, but I would say that certainly those first three phases are certainly really important. Great question. Okay. I think two more questions. So one was, how do you identify critical thinking skills in interviews? And here's what I would say is that when you start by saying, what level or phase of critical thinking skills do we want to require of someone who is coming into this job? Do we need them operating at a generate level or generate phase 4 from the beginning? Or is it okay if they're operating in somewhere in that execute phase? So, because that's going to determine, how you test for it. If someone's in the execute phase, you could create some type of assignment where you say, okay, here are your instructions. We'll give you 10 minutes, go ahead and follow these instructions and do it. And you see, can they execute? If someone's in the synthesize, if you want someone to be in the synthesize phase, there you could say, okay, read this report and, I'll give you 5 minutes to read it, and then I want you to tell me what does it mean and what are the 3 most important things that you picked up on from this report. So that would be an example of a synthesize. Recommend, similarly, there you could do a similar, kind of assignment-oriented test, or you could ask them about their own experience. What was a recommendation you've made in your professional career, and then push them on that. What alternatives did you consider? Why did you pick that one? What were the weaknesses associated with your recommendation? How did it turn out? And so you can kind of press them on their own experiences in recommendation. So those are, again, think about what phase you want them to be at, and then design your interview around that phase. The other thing that you can do is, there's several assessments of critical thinking. So Diane Halpern created one that's very widely used. Pearson created a critical thinking appraisal as well. And so if you're looking to kind of do this at scale and objectively compare different candidates, then that might be something that you want to invest in order to really be able to have a kind of an unbiased assessment of people's critical thinking skills. Okay, last question was, how do you find flaws in others' recommendations? And then kind of the question was, even we need, the person who asked the question was saying, even we need to be able to find our flaws in our own reasoning, which often, honestly can be harder because sometimes we're blinded to the weaknesses in our own opinion. And so where I would start, I'm going to give kind of a more of a methodical approach to it, which might be a bit cumbersome for some people. And then I'll give kind of a shorthand approach that you can use, in a more simple context. So I would go back to, in the training, we talked about 4 different sub-skills within recommend. And we first talked about logic and how when you recommend something, you need to make sure it's within the bounds of logic. And so first I would start with assessing the logical reasoning of a recommendation. Is there anything that seems off in terms of when you try to connect the dots, when you make the math equation, or however you can kind of conceptualize or visualize this argument that is being made or the case that's being made? Is there anything that logically doesn't make sense? Second was around probability. So they're understanding, what are the chances of this? Do we consider the probability? Do we combine probabilities in the right way? The example of the Apple Watch that we gave is, people can get in, kind of miscalculate probability very quickly once it becomes more complicated than a single probability. So that's something to think about. The third component or subscale was around evaluation. And there what I'd say is, when you're evaluating and say, okay, what were the criteria by which the person was selecting a recommendation? And does that criteria make sense? Was there anything missing? And then, we talked about weighting of criteria. So not all of the criteria may be of the same importance. Maybe this one's much more important. So did they weight the criteria? Did they weight it in a way that makes sense? That would be questions I would be asking. And then did they assess each of the options on those criteria in a way that feels right and, is consistent with what is known about that recommendation. And then, we did talk about the value of intuition. And so I would emphasize that while you do want to go through that rational, logical approach, you also want to say, intuitively, does this feel right? And does this make sense? And so do engage your intuition there. And then the fourth subscale we talked about was decision making. And we said, the key here is not falling into a bias around how you're thinking about decision making. And so there, I encourage you to, grab a list of some of the most common biases that happen when we make decisions, and just check yourself against those. Particularly, we talked about the confirmation bias and egocentric bias. So that's kind of a more methodical approach that you can say, we're going to go and approach this recommendation and really unravel it and see, is this a good recommendation? Now, all of that starts with the simple 3 steps that we mentioned in the training, which was, okay, did they consider multiple options? If not, that'd be a red flag, like, whoa, wait, we're probably missing something if we didn't consider anything else. So I'd start there. The second is, did they assess the weaknesses of their own recommendation and ask them, what do you think is the weakest thing about this? Where, if this were to fail, where would it fail? Those types of questions. You can ask yourself the same questions. If somebody were to criticize this recommendation, what would be the most common criticism of it? And then, the third piece was around the importance of analyzing the strengths of alternatives. What are the strengths? So asking yourself, what are the strengths of alternative options that this option is lacking? And so just going through that quick checklist around multiple options, assessing weaknesses, and looking at strengths of alternatives can be a quick way to understand if your recommendation is sound. All right, well, those are some great questions that we received in the critical thinking online intensive training. Feel free to post questions below or send us an email. We'd love to keep this conversation going, continue to engage with you. So thanks again for watching this video. If you liked it, go ahead and like it below, subscribe to our channel. We'll be continuing to post content like this. So thanks again. Have a great week.